as I thought about a little bit about what I want to talk about today, one thing became clear. I haven't shared my story for a while. Um, and as I was thinking, and I used to prepare like hours and have outline of everything I'm going to talk about, and I kind of just was able to let that go. I kind of can trust the process and have an idea of what I want to talk about. But one thing became clear as I was thinking about it, and that is that, in a sense, it feels a bit more like looking in a rear view mirror. Some of the most intense experiences that I've had through recovery, most difficult times, historically, when I've chatted in the past, when I've shared in the past, it immediately I could feel the rawness, and I was sort of still very much in that place of doing very intensive work. And I can say now is there's sort of more of this looking in a rear view mirror quality. And so it just feels a little bit different. It feels different to be able to talk about some of the things I want to talk about, knowing that I've done a lot of healing, and the vantage has shifted a bit, and I don't have the rawness with some of the stuff that I used to. So, but yeah, I just want to share a little bit about my recovery experience. And I'm coming up on 7 years in ACA. So February 14th, which at least in the US is Valentine's Day. And I started going to ACA around that time. I don't remember the exact date, but it was around then. So I picked Valentine's Day. I figured this is when I'm starting a new relationship with myself. And so it seemed fitting. And so I'm coming up on 7 years in a couple weeks here. When I first came to ACA, I was in a very rough spot. We talk about hitting a bottom, and adult child hitting a bottom in life. And I definitely sort of came on that place in my life. And, what I sort of saw is some of the major areas of my life were just really, I was having a hard time. So, I'm gay, and it came out in my early 20s. And mostly I just had sort of series of relationships, 2, 3 years here, sort of serial monogamy. But I had in 2015, 2014, 2015, when I found myself coming to ACA, the relationship that I thought was the one. This was like sort of going to be the one that changed everything. I'd take a year off from dating before I met this person that had fallen apart. And I felt a very intense rawness with that, like I hadn't felt before. And then I had a business. I created a business about 15 or 20 years prior, and it did really well, but then it stopped doing really well. And it was doing really well to the extent that I brought in a business partner, and it was web-based, and I needed someone to sort of vamp things up and be able to handle all the traffic we were getting. I brought in the smartest guy that I knew, and it turned out not to be someone who I could work with well. And so things were falling apart there in the work area. And then my sister, I'm very close with my sister. I have been my whole life. We've lived together at different times. We've been in business together. And she had a surgery that went not so well, and was experiencing these sort of strange symptoms, like these numbness in her legs, and just sort of very strange stuff that the doctors didn't know what was going on. And she became really pretty disabled. And so that was sort of something going on in my life. I ended up moving her in with me. So it was, at the time, I knew there was sort of a perfect storm of what was going on. The other piece was that I, at that time, realized that it was probably, I needed to quit drinking. And, I had looked at it sort of in my life. Drinking had always been a part of my life, but something in me just knew. And it was just sort of getting to this place of exhaustion. And so, I didn't drink in the ways that I heard of, other people talk about drinking, but I knew that it was a problem. And, and so I sort of came to the conclusion that I needed to make a change. So basically the place that I came to, if I sort of had realized that, I had hit bottoms throughout my life, my adult life in particular. I sort of, had hit sort of these things would be going along well, and something would sort of happen. I'd sort of feel a crash happen, and then I'd sort of find a way to sort of pull myself back up again and sort of get back up on the horse, so to speak. And but when I got to this last one, 2014, 2015, about 7 years ago, I just had the sense that like something needed to fundamentally change. That sort of this way of me sort of pulling myself back up again was just not going to work. I needed to make some really pretty fundamental changes, and I had a few ideas about what that looked like. The other thing is that so what I was doing as I was looking at things, I was looking at my life from the perspective of really seeing when I was in college hitting my first sort of really tough time. that was the vantage that I had when I started looking at myself. And in college, that's when as I said, that's when I started coming out. But I started having panic attacks, and as I recall, they're just very intense panic attacks. I'd had anxiety quite a bit, but what I experienced was just really terrifying, and it was just sort of this very surreal feeling. And it's hard to describe what it's like if you haven't had it, I guess. But um, it just sort of felt like it came out of nowhere. And there was a lot of pressure. I realized it was in college trying to figure out what I want to do. I thought maybe I want to be a doctor. Felt a lot of pressure to sort of decide what I wanted to do. And it was before I had come out. And so, through that process, I started seeing a psychiatrist, and I got on medication. I got antidepressants. I got on anxiety tranquilizers, and I started seeing, him professionally. And yeah, I couldn't say the word gay. I was just so scared of myself. I was so scared of what that meant for me. I was so closeted. And through the process, I was able to sort of work with that. And I realized as I was working with it and I was sort of coming into my truth, my anxiety was decreasing. I wasn't having the panic attacks in the ways that I was. And so that was sort of the impetus of me sort of coming into a greater truth at that point. And at that point, I figured, well, that was the problem. That's what the issue was. I just sort of need to come out, and that will take care of everything. And I tried to get off sort of antidepressants and the tranquilizers a number of times, but every time I did, it was I would just start experiencing a lot of anxiety again. So that's to say that sort of at that point in my life, that's when I realized that, I was just sort of doing the best I could to sort of get through, recognizing there was something going on. They told me at the time it was just sort of a biological thing. Some people have anxiety and you just take these things and it's a genetic thing and you take it like insulin, like a diabetic with insulin. So I just did it. And so, like I was saying, I went through, my adult life. I graduated. I pretty high functioning. I graduated with honors from college. I was graduated with psychology. My dream was to be a therapist. I decided not to be a doctor. That wasn't going to work out. I didn't like science in that way. But yeah, I was going to be a therapist. And, I graduated. I worked in that field for a while, child and adolescent psychiatric facility. I worked with LGBTQ youth. But that's another time where I sort of hit that brick wall. And I didn't know exactly what was happening. I just sort of realized I was sort of on overdrive all the time and I was exhausted. And I just had a sense that I couldn't do that type of work and be okay. Like I couldn't be to where that rawness was with other people. It was just bringing up too much stuff for me. So I sort of changed course at that point. I went back to school, got another degree in sort of multimedia development and internet application stuff. And I worked in that field for a while. I ended up starting my own business with my sister. It was in the tattoo industry, online, selling tattoo artwork. Did that for 15 years. That was successful. As I said earlier, I was dating, but my dating thing was just sort of 2 to 3 year relationship. And it just ended up, what I realized, it was just having the same relationship over and over again. And I basically would come in as sort of like a daddy type figure, someone who's sort of the rescuer, fixer type ACA stuff going on. And I would come into the relationship from that place. And eventually I would just sort of shut down. There was sort of, I think, a part of me realizing that I didn't feel safe or I wasn't getting my own needs met. I would just sort of shut down and then it would just sort of fizzle out. And then I would just sort of do that again. And that was sort of my adult life. And, again, 2015 or so is when I realized like, this just isn't going to work that way. So what did I do? I quit drinking. So 2014, I quit drinking alcohol. I'd experimented with a lot of other drugs throughout my life, but they didn't stick with me, but alcohol kind of did. And I just realized that whatever benefit I think I was feeling from alcohol, and in retrospect, I can see it was a lot of social anxiety. I felt more at ease. It was sort of being able to relax, be able to sort of go out and be around people and be fun, and people liked me. So, but whatever benefits that I felt from that, and decrease of anxiety when I was drinking, I didn't feel anxiety. Whatever benefits that was gone. And I would drink and I would have hangovers for like 2 days, and so I was just like, I need to quit drinking. So I did. I come from a 12-step family, and I'll talk about my childhood stuff in a little bit. But very early on, my mom went into AA, my dad went to Al-Anon, and we were brought to Alateen. So I knew about 12-step programs, and I checked out sort of regular standard AA meetings, and it just was too triggering for me. And I didn't know this at the time exactly, but what I realized was, even though my family was in recovery at that time, it was, and my family was still really dysfunctional, right? And so all the adult child stuff was going on. And so a lot of the language of 12-step programs was very triggering for me because it was sort of enmeshed with the dysfunction of my childhood. So like slogans were sort of used in ways and things like that. And so it just brought up a lot. So AA was a hard fit for me. And then the other thing was around religion and spirituality. Um, I was brought up pretty religiously. I was raised Jewish. My mom's side of the family was Lutheran. So my dad's side of the family were Jews in New York City. And my mom's family were homesteaders, people who went west in the US very early on into the wilderness and sort of carve a life out of nothing. And they were German and they were Lutheran farmers. And so two very different family backgrounds. My mom ended up converting to Judaism, and I was raised Jewish. I was bar mitzvahed. I was confirmed pretty religiously. But again, my mom's side of the family was Lutheran. And so I would go out to the family farm, spend summers out there, and it was going to church and reading the Bible in the morning. So a lot of religion for me and the upbringing. And then again, with 12-step programs, there can be a religiosity with that, or at least a spiritual framework, some might call it. And so I was raised in a lot of that. And again, that was sort of enmeshed with a lot of my dysfunction. I didn't really know that at the time, but it was enmeshed with my family dysfunction. So yeah, I was figuring it was time to quit drinking and bumped into AA and felt like that was going to be problematic. That wasn't going to fit real well for me. I did find a free thinkers in AA, which I'm really grateful for. And so it was a little bit different. It was different enough, especially on sort of the religious spiritual stuff, that I could kind of find a little bit of breathing room and get some support there. The other piece around the religion and spirituality is, of course, being gay, at least in the United States. It was always sort of bumping into the people who are most problematic for me. The ones who felt like they were most condemning of me were also the ones that were the most religious. So again, that was another sort of area where I was just bumping into anything religious was really tough for me. So yeah, I checked out, I did free thinkers in AA for a while and I quit. I have a sobriety date of April 1st, 2014. So that's coming up on 8 years. And so I did that for a bit and it was helpful. And then I found some Al-Anon. So again, I think I told you my dad was in Al-Anon for a while. So I checked that out. But that honestly just reminded me too much of my dad. And so that wasn't a good fit. But what was an Al-Anon meeting had sort of an adult child flavored meeting. And I remember reading that. And then I found out about sort of ACA. And that's when I found ACA. I found out about it. And I'll tell you what, the first time I read the laundry list traits, I just sort of knew that something was that was me, that applied to me. And it felt more right than anything else I had ever found. And so I found my way to my first ACA meetings. I was still living in Denver, Colorado. And I found myself at those meetings. And I just sort of had a sense that was going to be a part of my life. And something resonated with me. And I was like, and I'll be honest, it was sort of like a last resort. I'd read all the self-help books and, the 5 easy steps of changing your life. And ACA, what it put forward didn't seem simple or easy, but it was just sort of like I'd tried everything else and I needed to find something. I needed something different. So as I said, that was the context of my bottoming, my bottom of all bottoms in ACA. I was in a rebound relationship, I would call it that. Very nice guy, but it was sort of a reactionary relationship. And basically what happened was my brother was living in Tampa, Florida, which is near where I live now. And he suggested, Lou, maybe it's just time for a change. And so my sister, who was disabled, was still living with me. We decided to sell the house and get rid of all the stuff and just sort of the geographical cure and sort of pack up everything. My partner at the time, my sister and I all moved to Tampa, Florida. And that's really where I would say that's sort of the deepest part of my journey began. And that's when I was grateful and I think fortunate that in St. Petersburg, Florida, there was a very strong ACA community. The other thing that was going on at that point was meditation for me. I did find meditation when I was in Denver. It was through Shambhala, which is sort of a Western version of Tibetan meditation. And so that was another community that I found that was really helpful. And I just was learning to quiet myself and learning not to run. And what I realized was most of my life I had been running away from myself, running away from some sort of internal discomfort that was kind of always there. I might have called it anxiety at the time, but it was just sort of learning to sit with that a little bit more. And so I'll say meditation has been a central part of my recovery process. And we talk a lot about it at ACA. So there was a strong meditation community in St. Petersburg, and there was a strong ACA community in St. Petersburg, Florida, where I lived. And again, ACA was different enough that I felt like I could have some breathing room to sort of find my own way to do it. And for me, in ways that didn't work with some of the other 12-step programs. I wasn't excited about the ACA solution when I heard it. The solution, become your own loving parent. It sounded a little weird to me. The inner child stuff sounded kind of weird to me. I wasn't sure what to make of it. And the other piece that was going on was those medications that I was on. I'd quit drinking, and I tried to get off the medications when I was in Denver. And I went over a summer period of time. I did that. It was with a doctor, but there was just something in me that just said something wasn't right. I've been on these my whole life. I felt like, I'm not sure that's me. I'm not sure that this is working in the way, at least maybe that it did at one point. And so I found some resources around that too, and I decided I'm gonna do what I can to see if I can get off of that medication. And I found some resources. And to be very clear, I went through a very slow, methodical process. It was a 4-year process. But what I can say is I don't drink today. I'm not on any of those medications today. And also through the process, I had to give up caffeine. I was sort of a pot or two of coffee a day coffee drinker. That was my breakfast in the morning. And along with that breakfast, I had my supplemental breakfast of cigarettes. I smoked for 25 years. So there was a lot of chemical releasing of addictions that I was doing in my process. And so again, part of the context of my ACA recovery was releasing all of those. And part of it was this 4-year process of getting off of these antidepressants and tranquilizers. So meditation was a big part of it. And quite honestly, during that period, I was pretty disabled. It was hard for me to sort of say that word and realize that was going on, but I was not able to work. And I hit a pretty brutal part of my life. And, I don't know how much was sort of chemical withdrawal. I don't know how much was my ACA issues. And I'll never know. I'll never know how much was what, but that was my process. So in a sense, I did all my addictions recovery in ACA, and I did my trauma recovery in ACA. So that's not super common. A lot of people will find, other 12-step programs that sort of release whatever a lot of their addictions and chemical compulsions and stuff are. And then they sort of find their way to ACA, sort of a tier 2 recovery. Our Big Red Book even talks about that, secondary or second stage recovery, third stage recovery. But I kind of did it all at once, and I did it all in ACA, and that was just my path. Another issue for me coming in was sponsorship. I didn't know, again, at the time, I didn't really know what the deal was. I've discovered I have major authority issues and trust issues. Like I didn't trust, like for me, like there's an opposite laundry list quality of like, as long as I'm in charge, as long as I'm the one that's in charge and I don't sort of have that vulnerability of needing help, then I can kind of do that. But for me, like asking for help, for me, trusting someone that I sort of see an authority figure to be like actually helpful, not sort of coming from an inner critic place is sort of where I understood that. So that was another thing in 12-step programs. I was like, I don't think I can do that. I can't do that. So another thing I was grateful for with ACA is a little bit more flexibility around sort of how it is that we build recovery relationships. And so, it took me a while, but eventually I decided I was going to do 12-step work on the yellow workbook. And so I did it as part of a small work group. And, other 12-step programs, a lot of times you work the 12 steps, you go to meetings, you find a sponsor, you work the steps, that sort of mantra. So for me, I found a group of people. It was a small group, like 4 to 8 people or something like that. And we just met weekly and about an hour and a half. And we just sort of each week go through the yellow workbook. And that first time through, it was an incredibly powerful experience. There was 4 of us. 3 of us were completely new. One person had been around a little bit longer. And it just opened things up. And I realized that my difficulties didn't really start in college. Like I sort of identified, I started having panic attacks and my life fell apart, at age 20, and I needed to come out. And that was the story that I told myself. When I got to ACA and I started sort of, getting into the step work, it became much more clear that I'm like, wait a second, like things weren't right a long time ago. And, in the family that I grew up, again, it was a 12-step family, and we would acknowledge, that mom was an alcoholic and stuff. But, I told myself I didn't remember her drinking. When she was drinking, I was really young. I didn't really remember her drinking, and what's the big deal? My family looked really good on the outside, right? Sort of the model family. It was me, my younger sister, my younger brother, and then my mom and dad. And, we'd go to the temple. We were religious, and my dad was a professional. My mom was a professional, and we looked very good on the outside. I wasn't, beaten regularly. I didn't go hungry. And so, I read the Big Red Book, and, some of the things in there, they're pretty horrific. And as I've been in this program longer, and meeting people and hearing some of these stories, some of those didn't match up with me. And so, when I first came in, I identified with the laundry list traits. I knew my mom was an alcoholic, but I sort of was in this place that it wasn't that bad. And, I've come to realize that's called denial, right? But it's also part of what I needed as part of my survival. I needed to, as a kid, I learned I needed to believe that it was okay, that it wasn't that bad, because the alternative of seeing things accurately was too unbearable. I don't know that I would have survived that. So as I did that 12-step work and opened myself up to, what ACA calls the full remembrance, the truth of my childhood wounding, that, I didn't have a lot of memories, but it wasn't because all kinds of good things were happening. I didn't have a lot of memories because bad stuff was happening. And what I realized was that anxiety that I had, like I probably had that since I was really, really young, and sort of my propensity to sort of space out and dissociate and check out a bit. Like I had that since I was young. And I sort of came into a greater touch of understanding that, this me falling off the horse didn't just happen when I was in college, that there was a story behind all of it. And so with that, and it was about 16 months. Like we went very slow. We would read everything together, went through all the questions, and let everyone answer them as fully as they needed to. And my gosh, all the worksheets in step 4, I was just like, is this ever going to end? It's what it felt like. Honestly, it was a lot of work, but I just sort of stuck with it, and I knew that there was healing in the process. The other thing that I did that was really important to me was, I used childhood photos, which is something that our program suggests. We have to remember there was no loving parent guidebook at that point. It was just chapter 8 in the Big Red Book was talking about how to do reparenting, and there was a few pointers there. But for me, yeah, I definitely, one thing my family did, my dad took a lot of photos for most of my childhood. And so very early on, I got my hands on the photo albums, my family photo albums, and I would just turn through them. And I sort of, in a meditative state, I would just sort of go through them. And when I saw a photo that sort of, I felt a reaction in my body, I just put the whole album. I had a little copy machine or my printer. I put it on there, and I would print that. And I just made like this flip book of sort of photos throughout my childhood. And I'll tell you what, like that combined with sort of meditative practices, being able to just sort of slow myself down and actually be with these images of photos, over time and time again has been transformative for me. And I sort of was able to start to feel what maybe I couldn't have felt as a child in those photos. The inner child stuff was still pretty weird to me. But one of the other things I did early in recovery was I was seeing a therapist and using a modality EMDR. That was the one that worked for me pretty well. People can Google that. But more than anything, I think I realized that it was the person I was working with that made it work so well. That it was someone who was an older woman who I felt safe with. Looking back is really what it was. And I realized she spoke to the youngest parts of me, and the youngest parts of me felt safe with this person. And so we did EMDR, but I remember the point of getting in touch with my inner children, like for the first time. And it was through that process. And my dad, as I said, he's been not ACA recovery, but he's been doing recovery work, and he's been open to sharing memories when I had questions and stuff or information. And he told me about when I was very young, an example of dysfunction in my family, an example of my mom drinking before I could remember. And he said, all 3 of us kids were young, we were in diapers, and he came home one day. I was probably 3, and my sister was probably 1, and my brother was a newborn. He came home, and my mom was passed out on the floor and a bottle of vodka next to her. And he said, all 3 of you kids were in diapers, and he called them shitty diapers, dirty diapers. And he just said he just lost it. He just lost it. And he grabbed my mom and he picked her up and he threw her out the door into the snow. And he said, at some point, he said, I realized that, what are the neighbors going to think? Right. So, of course, he picks her up and he brings her back in. And he told me that story. And in the EMDR, and I had no actual recollection. I was 3 years old. But, in the EMDR process, there was something in me that remembered. And I don't know how to say it other than that. It was like a felt memory or emotional memory. But I was in that situation and sort of going through a visualization of it and going through a process around it. And what was interesting is I could sort of picture my mom there, and I could picture the 3 of us kids sitting around her. And at one point, this, I don't know, it was a figure that came in and picked me up and held me and took me out of that place. And I didn't know what that was. And so I was like, gosh, was that, sort of had thoughts of my uncle. My dad's brother had killed himself when I was 7 years old. And so I was like, was that my uncle, a spirit of my uncle, or what was that? And I was kept going through this process and sort of kept returning to the scene. And at one point, I sort of got this visual, and I could see that figure was me. Like, it was an adult me that came in and picked up that child me and said that this isn't okay. Like, this is just not okay. And just sort of picked me up and took me out of that situation. And at that point, that's when I was like, I think that's reparenting. I think that's what reparenting is. I think that's what ACA is talking about. So going through that process and several other processes like that, I came to a place of not needing to do this sort of EMDR technique, that just through my own meditative practices, I would start to meditate in the mornings and do oftentimes a walking meditation. And I could sort of bring myself back to that place and not just that place at 3 years old, but that place, the felt experiences of me at 3, at 5, at 7, when my dad's brother did kill himself, and the sadness that I felt. And I had these pictures, and I could picture my younger self. I could picture my faces, and I could see it, and I could feel it. And I just sort of got to know these younger versions of myself. And then, it was 8, but it was also 11 and 12 and 14 and 16. And that process that I'm describing has been my process of reparenting. And I've done, lots of the techniques. And I love the Loving Parent Guidebook. I was involved in the development and putting that out. And so did a lot of research for it and the techniques. But it's just so rich. And there's so many ways to do this type of work. There's no one right way for anyone, for all of us. We sort of all have to, I think, find our own ways. So, but I was doing that. So I had opened the door to reparenting, and it was a powerful experience. And then I was also seeing a sort of what I'll just call a spiritual practitioner. Just checking the time here. Spiritual practitioner. And, like doing like some sort of new agey types like soul retrieval and stuff like that. I was just kind of open to it and experimenting with different things, crystals and things like that. I kind of always had sort of liked that sort of stuff. Anyway, I was working with her, and it came to a point. She's like, I think you need to go on a journey. You need to go out into the wilderness. And I'm like, I do? I was like, okay, maybe I do. Maybe I do. And I didn't know a lot about camping or wilderness. I lived in Colorado, which is a mountainous western state in the United States. So I decided, I'm going to do this. And so I went on to Amazon.com and bought a bunch of camping stuff that I didn't know what I was doing, and I loaded it in my car. And so I came up with a beginning sort of thing that I was going to do, and I came up with an end thing that I was going to do on this trip, and I didn't know when. But my first stop was to do a rite of passage in Colorado, in the mountains of Colorado, and it was a 4-day vision fast. And so let me be clear, like, in my recovery, I brought my sort of adult child addictive sort of way of doing things self to most things I did, and I did it in my recovery too. So this idea of gentleness, love, and respect, this is something that's taken time for me. And at first, my recovery was very much not that. It was sort of like, go big or go home. We're going to heal, and I'm going to be the best meditator ever. And, it was just sort of, that's the place I was coming from. That's the best I could do, and it was okay. So anyway, I got this idea. I'm going I'm going to do a 4-day vision fast in the mountains. I've never, camped before. And so that's kind of what I did. And was it the best choice? I don't know, but that's what I did. So, but I went out there and I did the vision fast. And yeah, it was like I went out and it was a beautiful process that I did. And sort of you walk through and they smudge you and you become spirit and you have a tarp. I had a tarp, a knife and 4 gallons of water. And I just sort of go out into the wilderness and like talk about sitting with yourself and just sort of being with yourself, sort of that no escape. I'm just with me and there's no one to talk to. There's no electronics. And I was just sitting and whew, like that was an intense piece. On that trip, I hiked 14,000-foot mountains. I don't know what that is in meters, but it's tall. It's very tall. Not as tall as your Himalaya mountains. I know that in India, but for US, it's tall. And I went to Death Valley, which is sort of this desolate place in the California US. I did a week-long silent meditation retreat in Monterey Bay, California, with a Tibetan sort of school thing. I drove along the West Coast. I saw Crater Lake, all these national parks, the redwood forest, giant trees. And then I got all the way up. So Florida is in the southeast of the US. I got as far as I could. I ran as far as I could possibly, well, drove as far as I could possibly drove in the United States to be not where I was. And when I was there, I was in Olympic National Park in the US. I was in the Hoh Forest. And I felt an eeriness sort of come up in me. I felt something sort of opening as I was camping there. And as I was leaving, I was driving and I felt something that I had never felt before. I just felt this huge rush of release. I just felt this, I'd start crying. I had to pull the car over. I was crying. I was sort of screaming. I was yelling. And I was just sort of like coming to this place. And I think I was just realizing I can't run anymore. Like what I need to do is actually just sit still and be with myself. But this sort of release happened. It was a release and it was just an emotional release like I had never experienced. And when I shared the story before, I said I didn't realize that emotional pain could be so physically painful. Like I didn't know that. It was just painful, like these feelings just releasing. And I didn't really know what to make of it, but I sort of sat there, I collected myself. And what I realized was for a few days after that, I felt no anxiety, like just zero anxiety. And so what I realized was like all of these stuffed emotions and sort of everything that was sort of stuck in me, like it was stuffed truth. And that was sort of my anxiety. That was my depression and anxiety. And so became very clear to me that I needed to sort of open that up. And so it was clear to me when I was doing the inner child work, it was clear to me it was just very clear to me that I was on the right path, that what ACA was saying was accurate for me, at least, that I needed to get in touch with these old wounds, that I needed to release them, that I needed to meet them with something other than this critical, harsh part of myself. I needed to meet those parts of myself, these inner children, with some sort of tenderness and find that within me. Because when I did, I found a sense of relief and I found a sense of calm. And I guess I was like, I think maybe that's what people call serenity. Like maybe that's what they're talking about, like this sort of okayness, right? I'm like, I think that's what they're talking about. So I continued on the trip and, um, so I went 9,000 miles. It was 108 days and, sort of thing. It was an epic sort of trip. And, realistically, I didn't really want to be in Florida. I didn't want to be where I was living, but, I probably didn't want to be wherever I was. And I sort of realized I sort of found my way back to Florida. I was still living there. I moved down. My partner who I had moved down with, like I was in such bad shape. And it was like, he had not signed up for that. He left like 2 months after we moved down. But I continued to live with my sister and for a bit and just sort of found myself back in Florida. And I was like, I need to stop running. And I'm not going to be comfortable anywhere. It's part of this process, like the program said, it's becoming more comfortable with being uncomfortable, more comfortable with discomfort. And so it was just a willingness through my meditative practice, through the reparenting to the degree that I could, and learning how to do it more gently over time, how not to run from myself, how to sort of just be with myself, how not to abandon myself. So yeah, I was back in Florida and I just continued. I continued to get off of, the medication I was trying to get off of. Again, it was a 4-year process. It was very long. It was just sort of taking little chunks of, it was very slow and tedious and painful. I continued. I ended up doing 12-step work. I went through the yellow workbook 2 more times. over a several year period. So I found other groups with different people in them, and I went through the process. I went through the second time, and then I went through a third time. And it was amazing because I went through the steps the second, third time. Like I swear I didn't read this before, right? It was like every time I went there's a freshness to it, and it was a deepening to it. So I sort of came to realize that my recovery it was a marathon. It wasn't a sprint, and that, whether it's step work or reparenting, that it's going to be me learning to live differently. It's not me fixing something so I can go back to something else. It's me going to a place that I had not yet been to, and me discovering what that was going to be. Um, I ended up doing the traits workbook, laundry list traits workbook, also as part of a small group. Also, that one we went very, very slow. That was like a 2-year process, and that was an all men's group. So I did some groups that were men and women, some groups that were a couple that were just men. And that was a powerful experience. To the traits workbook for me, to sort of have the laundry list, the opposite laundry list, and sort of put it together, there's like this no escape quality. So like if I didn't see myself on the laundry list, I was probably in the opposite laundry list for something. And so that was sort of like, I've sort of understood that as really in-depth sixth and seventh step work. That's what I sort of see that laundry list traits workbook. It's working with, some people call them defects of character. I don't like that term. A lot of people in ACA don't, but my survival traits, and recognizing I need to address those. And that's what I need to do. So as I started getting healthier, I started being of service more in the program. I knew when I first went into ACA, I needed to not do that. Like me, I was the best little boy in the world. I was the overachiever. I was the rescuer. I was the one that comes in and takes over and makes sure everything is great and everyone's happy with it. And I needed to not do that in ACA. That was very clear to me. So I was very slow to step into service, which is exactly what I needed to do. Over time, I started chair meetings. This is all in person at the time. So I would chair meetings, and at some point I was a literature person. And then at some point I was a secretary, treasurer. So I sort of went through and did that, but I was very slow getting into that sort of service, which was important for me. But as I mentioned too, I wasn't working. I was pretty disabled. I decided that I want to get involved with ACA WSO, the World Service Organization, be of service there, and that might be a way for me to start stretching a bit. And so I love in the Loving Parent Guidebook how it talks about the challenge zone. So like sort of has these 3 circles, one inside the next, and sort of talking about that comfort zone, I think it is, or safety zone. I mean, I forgot what it is, comfort zone. But sort of we can easily sort of in recovery sort of just stay in our own little world and not stretch at all. And sort of it feels comfortable and cozy, but it can start to feel small. And sort of the idea that our sanctuary becomes a prison. If we don't stretch, we just sort of end up in this place of just, I don't want to feel any discomfort. I don't want to bump up against the triggers in the world. So I just kind of keep things small. And then we talk about the overwhelm zone. The Loving Parent Guidebook talks about you go to the overwhelm zone, and that's re-traumatizing, right? That's not not the gentleness, love, and respect. That is the go big or go home, and you sort of overstretch. And at that point, there's not healing that's happening. It's just really sort of re-traumatizing. And we don't always have choices. Sometimes life presents itself, and we have to stretch more than we wanted to. But really, there's sort of this idea of it being a challenge zone. And so I sort of decided that WSO was going to be a challenge zone for me. And it was how I was going to start to build a routine in my life again. I'd done a lot of inner work, and I did a lot of journaling, was a huge part. I mean, I have stacks of writing, and maybe someday I'll go back and write something up, but lots of inner work, but I need to sort of re-engage with the world again. And so, I've written, I've published some books and stuff. So I'm like, well, maybe I can contribute that way. And so I got involved with ACA's WSO's literature committee. I started getting involved. There was a project of doing some stuff. So I sort of gravitated to the reparenting stuff. So I did a deep dive with that, and I became friendly with Bonnie M., who's the person that had the Loving Parent Guidebook project. So she and I had many conversations because I was writing for another project, and we're sort of, what are we going to present to the fellowship for reparenting? What's that going to look like? And, is an inner loving parent the same thing as a healthy adult, or is it not? Like sort of a lot of discussion around it. What's the Big Red Book Chapter 8 say? So that was important for me to sort of get involved in that way. I also at one point decided with a couple people in my local area to start a beginners group. a beginners group in ACA. I tried going. I did check out AA a couple times over the years. I'm like, and more than anything, it wasn't. I didn't go back there and find all kinds of sort of great recovery stuff. It was more like testing my triggers. And I'm like, oh, every time I go back, it's like it doesn't feel quite as triggering for me. And I'm like, yeah, I'm testing my ACA recovery by going to an AA meeting, I think is what I was doing. Um, and again, I don't want to put that AA's, it saves lives, and it just wasn't for me. So I just want to make that clear. But anyway, they had a beginners meeting. I'm like, well, maybe ACA needs a beginners meeting. And there's like 18 meetings in my area. There's very strong ACA. I was like, so we started a beginners meeting, and then we realized we're like, maybe we need to come up with some beginners materials. This big red book can be pretty overwhelming for people, and a lot of people don't know where to start and can feel overwhelmed. So a couple people and I got together and we started a writing project. It's now called A New Hope. Maybe some of you have heard of that. But we ended up writing that. So I did a lot of writing on that and sort of headed that project. We've recently submitted that to WSO. So we've been doing testing in the field for several years, and we're on draft 5 and submitted that to WSO. But again, sort of writing the reparenting chapter in that and stuff, doing a lot of research on that. And then I've been involved with a spiritual inclusion group for the literature committee. So again, you sort of notice the sponsorship was shaky for me. So how else can we find resources for beginners? So it was just me taking my own experience and saying, is there something I contribute to ACA? Because maybe there's other people that have similar challenges too. So the chair of the literature committee at the time asked if I would head a spiritual inclusion group for ACA. And I kind of didn't want to do that because it was so triggering for me. But I felt like I could stretch with that, and I did, and I'm grateful that I have. And it's been a powerful transformative process for me to really be with some other people that have struggled in these ways in this area of our program, and to find my own sense of spirituality that works for me. And I'm just so grateful ACA has, again, provided enough space for me in ways that maybe some other 12-step programs didn't for me. To be able to do that. So, I'm still not a deist. I don't really sort of believe in a personified idea of a higher power. When I've spoken before, I talk about it's more like Star Wars and the Force. It's sort of, I was 6 years old when Star Wars came out, and that idea, well, I have a quote here. So this is a Obi-Wan Kenobi quote. So he says, The Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us, and it binds the galaxy together. So that's just something like resonates with my inner kids, right? Like that is something that is bigger than me. It's not something that I feel like I have a direct relationship with. That doesn't work for me, but it's something that energizes and charges my inner loving parent, because that is something that resonates with me. There is definitely a healer part in me, and I've come to really embrace and believe that if not everyone, pretty much most people on this planet have this capacity for compassion, have this capacity to heal themselves, this capacity for compassion, for clarity, for a sense of creativity, an inner sense of courage, all these C words, right? These are sort of me as inner loving parent or this healthy adult self that if I can work with and heal these other kid parts of me, then what naturally emerges is this sort of spiritual self. I don't know what to call it really. I will say that in reparenting, before I could even get to the inner child stuff, the first step for me was really working with a critical parent, my inner critical parent. I knew that was there very clearly when I came into the program. Like that, I was like, yeah, I've got an inner critic. That's clear to me. And the meditation was really one way of how I learned to work with that. And mindfulness meditation, focusing on my breath, recognizing when my mind wandered to thinking some thought, because that's what minds do. This was a central practice to me. And it was learning every time I would take my mind, the focus off of the thought and return back to my breath, focus on my breath, recognize at some point I'm thinking about something else and just sort of let that go and come back to my breath. That's an antidote to dissociation. That is a methodology to working with my inner critic, because that's what I have to do. I have to recognize my inner critic is activated, and I have to find a way to set a boundary with that and to be able to say, okay, I hear you, and there's a thought and that's really agitated and stuff, but at this point, I just need to let that go. So that's been a central process for me. And what I realized is as I worked with creating more inner space with my inner critic, setting boundaries with my inner critic, creating a sense of inner space, this sort of idea of this inner loving parent or healthy adult self or true self, adult true self part of me sort of has emerged. And that's the part of me that is now taking the lead in my life more than not. And that's the part of me when that part is available, when I'm in that part, when I'm connected to that part inside of me that again is connected to something bigger, things that are bigger than me that I don't fully understand and probably never will. And that's okay. That when I can sort of connect into that and energize that, and I create a sense of inner safety, that's when the truth of my full self comes out. That's when my inner kids can come and and be a part of my life and to share what's going on. That's when I connect into my feelings. That's when I connect into my needs. And, I wish I could say that I'm in that place 24/7 all the time, and I'm just not. And I don't know that anyone ever is. But, I'm in that place more often, uh, more frequently, and I'm grateful for that. And when I fall off, when my inner critic takes over, when I feel disconnected from the truth of who I am, that happens still. And there's days I still wake up with anxiety. I don't have panic attacks anymore. I'm grateful for that. I have, I don't know if you want to call it altered states, but, in my meditative practice, sometimes people might call it bliss states, but really expansive sort of stuff. And I think, in the context of trauma, those expansive states, become panic attacks. It's too big. It's too untethered, right? And there's not a grounded sense of okayness. And to me, that's this inner loving parent or true self part of me, or just self with capital S. This part of me, this is the part of me that can see the middle ground, right? The critical parent is all or nothing, right? It's either it's awesome or it sucks. It's right or it's wrong. I'm going to fail or whatever. And perfection, I'm a perfectionist, that's tied to it, right? But this inner loving parent like starts to open up this vast expansiveness of okayness, this in-between area that just sort of starts to open up. It's not this or that, right? It's most of life is somewhere in between. But that's like the part that I could never see. It was either perfect or I fail, right? If I'm not in the top 95th percentile, there's nothing other than that, other than failure. And that's what I was raised with, right? And that sense of control that I had, what I associate with my inner critic too. Because, I needed to try to control the outside environment as much because failure meant devastation. It meant my inner critic was just going to pummel me, right? So trying to control everything and so that I don't bump into all these triggers that activate my inner critic. So learning to work with those parts of me have been important. And I'll say one other thing with the inner critic is that it's really evolved over time. First of all, it's not just one inner critic. I've sort of come to an understanding for myself that I have multiple sort of critical aspects of myself that have different flavors. And that's been sort of how I've worked with it. I've also discovered that even though we might call it an inner critical parent, for me, my understanding is that really it's still just a parentified child. It's still, my inner critic is still a layer of protection that I developed when I was very young. And my inner critic is just sort of like an out of control kid, right? And when I'm in my wounded child place, that inner critical parent feels like this huge adult figure that feels overwhelming and stuff. When I get some distance from that, when I connect into sort of my inner loving parent, all of a sudden that critic takes on sort of a kid flavor. It's almost like it's just a part of me that needs a timeout, right? And so that's the gentleness I think that I've been able to discover, right? It's just a part of me, and that part of me is exhausted, right? Like that part that's so trying to control everything and trying to keep everything in order, like these manager parts of myself, right? Trying to just keep everything in place. That was my ACA bottom. These parts of me would just get exhausted, right? And it's just like, I can't do this anymore. It's just too much. It's too out of control. And I would fall off and I would hit these tough places and hit these panic places because I can't hold on anymore. So as I've used this ACA framework of reparenting, it's really helped me understand sort of how it is that I've lived my life and what it is that I've been experiencing in ways that are useful for me, in ways that I can look back and I can be like, oh, that's what was going on. That makes sense to me now. And there's just sort of a growing sense of peace, I think, for me that comes with that. So I'm coming up, I'm just checking my time, and I want to make sure that we leave a little time if people want to sort of ask questions I can respond to. But if I can just take a minute just to check in with myself. And I can feel my energy rising as I'm speaking and stuff, just to sort of, if I can calm down just for a minute and just see if there's anything else that I want to say before I close out. Just thanks. Yeah, let me just say a little bit more about where I'm at now. And I've gone back to school. So here I am, 50, almost 52. And this is completely not what I had planned, not the place that I had planned to be. And I have not been working for a number of years, and I'm grateful that my business allowed me to have some savings to where I could do this for a bit, but that only goes so far. So I'm not independently wealthy. I need to work again. And so I've gone back to school for social work. So when I went, my undergraduate degree was in psychology and I worked in that field and I just ran into my childhood wounding. That's what happened. Like looking back, um, let me say too, when my life fell apart in 2015, that perfect storm, I realized, that my business partner that I sort of had this contention with, he was stepping into a role of my dad, right? My sister that got sick, and was disabled, she was bringing up all my mom's stuff. My mom was sick throughout my whole life, and I was the one taking care of her as an oldest kid. I felt it was my job. And then that relationship that didn't work, like that was just me completely running into my childhood self. That was me running into the part of me that wanted to find a boy like me at age 12 or 13. And I was just so scared and terrified and alone. And if maybe I could just find someone that sort of I could talk to, someone like me, that it would be okay. And even if the whole world was scary and didn't accept me, if I could just find that one person. And that's what I ran into. And when that crumbled, all of that crumbled at the same time. And it was my childhood. My childhood just crashed. I crashed into my childhood. Right. So, yeah, when I went to college and I thought I was sort of going, I want to be a therapist. I want to go out into the world and do that sort of stuff. And I tried and I ran into my childhood. And that's what I did in my life. I just kept running into my childhood over and over again. So, I just, through my recovery, I realized I think I can do this now. I can be who it is that I feel like I'm supposed to be in my career. So I've gone back to school for that. And that's sort of the arena that I'm working now. Relationships, I really swore off from relationships. I needed to take a step back. I realized my primary relationship was with myself. My primary relationship I needed to foster was between my inner loving parent and my inner children. But, I'm open to it now. I'm kind of starting to date a little bit. And, I'm the people who looked like who it was that was going to work for me most of my life, like that doesn't look the same to me now. And so my ideas of what love and partnership and commitment are going to be for me look and feel completely different. And I'll tell you what, whatever sort of primary relationship I get into, it's going to look a lot more like my relationships with my recovery partners, that sense of openness and honesty and connection. And that is now the model of what I take into what a romantic relationship would be. It's my idea of romantic relationships when it used to be like that's gone. That's not what I want. Right? It's just not what I want. It's not going to fit for me. And so again, it's moving into this place. I don't know exactly what it looks like. I just kind of more know what it doesn't look like. And I can trust that my inner kids trust that I'm not going to be with someone and abandon them again. So it's a slow process, but that's opening too. So I just kind of continue to stretch. And then I continue with my ACA service. We wrote that handbook and I'm still involved with some beginners meetings. I started a gay men's ACA meeting, call them gay CAs. And it's been beautiful, like, because, inner kids kind of all have their different flavors. There's, people of color meetings and people from different countries, different languages. I hear my inner kid doesn't speak English. Like for me, I needed to connect with other men who felt that sense of shame and isolation from a world that said you're broken and you are an abomination and all of these things. I need to connect with other people that lived through that. And this was when I was doing it, it was the burgeoning of the AIDS epidemic. Like that's when I was doing this. And it was just scary. It was terrifying. And I had all my ACA stuff buried underneath. ACA was my first closet of don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. And then just piled another closet on top of that. So to be able to connect with people that have similar experiences as me. But I connect with all ACAs. Everyone that comes into Adult Children of Alcoholics, we have something in common. We have a shared experience, and the people that over time stick around, we have a shared desire to heal ourselves. And I would say those that don't stick around probably have an underlying desire to heal themselves too. But, we all do this in our own way and in our own time. So I think that's what I have to say. I appreciate all of you being here and holding space and allowing me to share some of my experience with you.